I'll talk a little bit about, I've never done this format before, but I'll just kind of share with you what we talked about, and then Michael can join me in a second, who also participated in my workshop. Some of the things that we talked about, kind of the first thing we talked about was just the history of La Botanica, but especially like in relation to this idea of a utopia. And it was kind of two parts, this idea of utopia, so rethinking, revisiting this idea of no place and possibilities, and kind of focusing on this idea of why we even create in the first place, and just kind of going to this more kind of dreaming kind of a place, and thinking about the impetus to create art. And once we kind of think about that, thinking about rethinking the kind of way that we frame art. So some of the words I talked about were in relation to La Botanica, so we used keywords instead of like a kind of mission statement or a vision statement. And some of those keywords were reciprocity, latitudes, soulfulness, processes, open-ended. One of the key things was this idea of uncertainty and not knowing, and really how to like actually kind of anchor on that, to kind of frame unknowing, not knowing, uncertainty, failure within the creative process. But more importantly, what I was trying to translate it to was within an infrastructure or an institution. How can an institution be a living, breathing organism and embrace uncertainty and failure? Michael, do you want to talk a little bit about your experience in the workshop too, or?
It was a fabulous workshop. I thought it was about space and allowing a lot of it, so it's conceptual, you know, and psychological, and that Ayana was opening up the possibility of getting yourself comfortable and finding like a situation that allows you to create art, and quite frankly, I thought at first it was really ambiguous what was going on, and then I finally got it, you know, like, well, that's the point, you know, is to illustrate just how open-ended things can be, and to open ourselves to possibilities.
3 minutes left.
Okay, so I can talk more. We also talked about fragility. I think that a lot of times within art institutions and arts organizations, artist projects, we are often encouraged to kind of embrace kind of sentences versus question marks, and this idea of just kind of the fragility, kind of not knowing, uncertainty, really kind of centering on that, but forming institutions around that, and rethinking the structure of institutions so that we think about hybrids too. So thinking about the artist as an entrepreneur, but simultaneously, so this is this paradox, this idea of embracing this kind of space that has like these kind of fragile moments, has actually factors in pauses within the infrastructure, has uncertainty, has room for kind of all these multiple audiences. But it is this idea, how do we embody this as an infrastructure and an institution? So, and so we also answered a couple of kind of again, there was a kind of ambiguity to it, but these, some questions as well. So maybe you can speak about maybe some of the questions that we...
Yeah, you can tell that if there were an institutional frame for what Ayana was talking about, you would be hard-pressed to find it. So you don't even want to ask a question like, well, so I won't. Just leave it open. I think I have a problem with using the word failure, you know, because I think that we make discoveries and that we have to trust each other enough to be accountable as much as we can be as we try to discover ourselves in our art. So I don't even like error. It's just trial and discovery, and that's what we're all doing here.
And know is what it was centered on. Discovery, exploration, we embrace failure, what does that lead to? So, thank you.
This was, so gauging the gray area of human spectrum was, I guess, like part one of a two-part workshop or set of complementary workshops with Helena Keefe, and they were based on a workshop we did at UC Berkeley for the Value and Labor in the Arts practicum, which a lot of this event came out of. So in the first part of the workshop, we were kind of using, well, each of our workshops, I'll say, were kind of like inspired by a project by myself that got me involved in this, and another by Helena. So Helena's project is standard deviation, which she'll speak about, I'm sure. And mine is the non-participation, and it's a collection of artist letters in which they say no to invitations to exhibit or present or perform, all that. So it kind of really becomes about like why we say no or when we might say no, and really looking at like when and why others have done that. So for this workshop, we began with reading and just kind of sharing some of the letters among the group. And that led into an exercise, which went so well, it was really fun, the human spectrogram, basically, where we read out a number of kind of scenarios for exhibition invitations that artists encounter quite commonly. So like one was like, I'm a 25-year-old artist and I have $80,000 in debt from my MFA. I've been approached by a commercial gallery to have a solo show at a fair, but I'll need to go, like $3,000 to cover the cost of framing. Should I do it? There you go. And so, by these scenarios, participants would align themselves, along the yes/no spectrum on the floor. And after doing a couple scenarios, we added another spectrum, which was kind of like the practical to the ideal, which was really almost getting at like the personal or emotional dimension to these decisions. So, where we might say yes to something because it sounds good, business-wise, we might not feel great about why we made that decision. And I'm going to have our participant, one of our participants, Nicole, join us. Because actually one of the, you introduced one of the scenarios that we worked with during the spectrum. You actually kind of raised a lot of interesting questions about, well, what it is, well, maybe you can explain it.
Tell the story. Yeah, sure. It was one where I've been invited to speak in a kind of dinner type microfinancing project. So they invited 3 artists to each come, and you would pitch a project or talk about your project for 20 minutes to, I think, a group of 20 or maybe 20 odd people who had paid to attend the dinner, and a part of the proceeds from your dinner went into a pool of money that would, the diners would then vote on which of the 3 artists got the pool of money at the end. So, and it was $300. So they were asking for sort of a 30-minute presentation to a group of people, and then you might get $300 if you won the presentation. So, yeah. And that one brought up a lot of, people more agreed on that one. Yeah.
It's complicated.
Moved around. What was so nice about the spectrum is that as people talked and explained their position of why they had been in the yes or the no, people would start moving.
Yeah.
And we were convincing and unconvincing and persuading each other in a way that was really, really great. And I think too, like what also showed up for me in the thing was having to consider different roles in the arts world, and I think, if you'd worked, I think lots of people in this kind of artist-run sector may have worked as an administrator, as an artist, as an independent critic, so thinking about how you would answer that question based on sort of previous experiences really would color how you were situating yourself on the line, and I think we often move in those gray areas even within one particular practice sometimes.
Yeah, and it really kind of came about like what, not only just how variable these kinds of decisions are, but also like kind of got people thinking about at what points in any of these scenarios can be negotiated or like need further clarification or something like this. So at the tail end, we did this we did an exercise where we were working with this kind of like sample artist-writer agreement that I had first used with this space, the Luminary in St. Louis, when I presented non-participation there. And essentially, we had the group split up into small groups of like 4 people or whatever, and responding to one of the scenarios given or to their own scenario, just to kind of begin to map out, in really like a contract form, what they might need to accept the situation or to make it more equitable. Maybe then working towards clarifying the gray area.
Practicing what it feels like to say, this is what I need to make this worthwhile, which I think is a really good.
And to do that, with a room of other artists and practitioners, and kind of see how complicated that gets from person to person.
The first half I talked about the space, and I tried to lay out some of the ideas and principles that guide me in making decisions about Alabama Song. If I did it again, I would probably spend less time about the space and more on the second half, which was focused on the American royalties, which we actually had a good conversation building. So I started talking about the space, the limits of running a space from your home with 0 budget, and exploiting that, making that actually something that works for you. There is some joys of not having to answer certain types of problems with art spaces, which I fly way over my head. I kind of gave a history and talked about the limitations of the space, and the importance of having. One of the limitations is that it's a small space. You can only support maybe 30 or 40 people, because of that, the people that attend are involved, very heavily involved in what's on the exhibition or what's being performed, what the lectures, the workshops, the people that we get because of the limitations of the space is actually a strength in the end, because the crew of people that end up showing up are very committed to it. In fact, a lot of them are involved with the space and have done things. At certain points, it becomes more of a collaborative effort with regards to programming and even just staging events. A lot of times there's a lot of people here in the audience that have done events at the space and not only planned them but performed or taught. I also was talking about how the space is it's kind of leveled in terms of like what sort of programming we do. It's not, the sort of workshops are as important as video shows and the other sort of things. I use art space, but it's kind of a shorthand because we all kind of know what that means. Independent art space usually means a specific type of thing. This is that, but it also is not closed down to just being that. So we have a lot of experimental sound, and a lot of poetry, a lot of writing. The writing scene in Houston is really vibrant, so because of that, it just seems so perfect. The art audience is so different from the writing audiences. When you go to a show, you're kind of wandering around and talking and stuff, which happens at the poetry readings, but once the reading starts, everyone is there. There's no kind of rambling around. It's not like an art show. So seeing these different audiences actually has been really advantageous for me because I wasn't involved in some of these other art forms before. Maybe I should bring my help.
Let's see. One thing that I noticed about Gabe's introduction and description of Alabama Song was that it was kind of kind of an iterative practice. There didn't seem to be like a hardcore tenets that were going to establish the practice for everything because it was so widely variegated. But it was a practice of building an organization on practice. I mean, the networks built on previous networks, and then it grew from there. And you know, audience and community builds from each attempt and every articulation of the project and every opening of the space. I also thought it might be considered a kind of an artist-centered space as opposed to an audience-centered space. I mean, it's about developing a practice and being willing to fail or shutting the doors and having an artist conversation about work being developed. And that actually helped us get into the second part, which is about the art contract, which we spent a good amount of time using the solid lit description of his, kind of like a writer's, what he would ideally see in terms of the sale of his work and the control, subsequent control of his work after sale, including royalties. And then we got to talk about royalties and valuation of work, and it all tied into the conversations we've been having today about valuation and sale and retail, things like that. Ended up also talking about the fetish of hand-touching objects, valuation of those objects compared to machine-made objects. Where else did we go with that conversation?
What's that? Oh yeah, there's also, I forgot about that. The Texas Junior Senator is out here for selfies, and maybe send him a note to support the American Royalties Act. But I doubt he will. I just want to say one last thing. Lise was in the session, and I had never met her, never seen her, I hadn't met her. And every point I was bringing up, she was like nailing all of these things. And I was like, who is this? It was so good, and I kept thinking, is this a local Houston art? I was like, I have to get this person to Alabama. And then later on, I was like, oh yeah. It makes so much sense. It was actually a really good conversation. I wish I would have spent less time in Alabama song and more on that, because I think it's a conversation that we continue.
The project and workshop and made it happen with me. So my workshop was Codependency Anonymous, 12 Steps to Freedom from Arts Funding Addiction, which I think we can all probably say in some way, being a part of the art world, we have a little bit of that to work on. So what we did was we went through and we all raised our hands and asked who is a professional here. Everyone agreed on that. We were all professionals in the arts world. Kind of listed what sort of professions exist in the arts world, and that was about maybe 9 different things. Artists, what else, guys?
Curators,
curators,
executives, or runners of institutions.
Right. People managing, writers, critics, so on and so forth. And then we really broke down, what do we actually do on a daily basis? What are we? If we were to rename our profession, if we were to describe it to someone else outside of the art world, what are we? What do we do? So what are you guys actually? What professions do you actually engage in? What were they for you?
What did we get?
Oh, we wound up with like researchers,
Activists, archivists,
travel, travel show hosts. It was just this one
fabricators.
We, in our groups, we would try to describe what it was that we did without using sort of the like keywords of like we make installation art and that kind of thing. And the other people in our group would feedback with what kind of job that described. And I found like both like learning what they came up with, but also just the exercise of trying not to use the vocabulary that I normally use and just actually get to like the brass tacks of what I do to be quite useful.
So then we ended up, throughout all 20 to 25 participants, there was a list of maybe 75 things that were professions that us as professionals, what we were, what we did, how we could re-describe ourselves and revision ourselves to people outside of the art world. And so the idea, and that also included prostitutes, pimps, counselors, chefs, anyone else? Shout out, therapists. Who else was in the session? What were some of the other things? Documentarian, astronaut,
Event planner,
what?
Shaman.
Shaman. Yes, Fisher. fisher people. Yeah, lots of different things, So then the idea was to, as you revision yourself and you're having trouble getting arts funding within that world, which of course we always see that as an opportunity, that is always open. On the other side of things, there's a whole other world, the society that is supposed to be helping us, to let us contribute and to value us. So we need to go to them to ask them for funding as well. So I spoke of a couple of different projects that I do. I did a project called Bus Stop Opera, where I collected conversations on public transit. Verbatim, those conversations became the libretto for operas. They were scored with original compositions, and then the operas were reperformed at the bus stops where the conversations were collected. And so that whole project over 3 years with a staff of 40 in each different city was funded through the public transit in each of those different cities. I currently run a project, a co-director, it's been going on for 4 years now, called Conflict Kitchen. We only serve cuisine from countries with which the US government is in conflict. And then that food comes wrapped in interviews that we've done with people from that country and those that have immigrated to the US. The budget for that project is $1 million a year. We have 18 staff that all have insurance, get free classes through Carnegie Mellon University, who is one of our fiscal sponsors, and they actually like their job. So anyway, right, it was about revisioning sort of how we can be valued and sort of letting go of this idea of us as artists. And then maybe reclaiming in the end. So just the 12 steps that we went to were, 1, don't call it art. 2 minutes left. Okay. Relinquish the title of artist. Context first. Think of the context even before you think of the form of the work or the medium, even if you typically work in one particular medium. Place the form within the stream of everyday life, and that can be a traditional arts structure or context. Remember that the public is coming through a gallery or a museum. Stop thinking about it and do it, and then charge, and that could be in terms of financially charging, or charge in terms of responsibility or audience to participate. We talked about, do you ever ask when someone's looking at your artwork at an opening, which is like the most uncomfortable place to be, like just standing next to your art, and you're like trying to see if someone's looking at it. Anyway, just go up to them and say, what do you think about what's going on here? Fail, which I think we've all probably covered in all of our sessions. Listen to your audience, be responsible to them by being responsive. And there's always someone that can do it better than you. Hire people, and then pay those people to work for you. And then stop the project when it no longer satisfies, or perhaps we came to the definition of perhaps pause. 1 minute.
Oh, we discussed, we've got a big project that's taking us around to a lot of different localities around the country, researching queer histories. And so discussing who might be partners outside of the traditional arts funders, and who might be a logical partner. And something that Dawn mentioned in her presentation was that a lot of these other institutions or city councils or that kind of thing actually have pots of money that they can allocate to the arts, even if they don't explicitly say that.
And outside of just financing, the concept that you can sort of micro-divide your practice into ways of talking about it and thinking about it that gives you strategic access to other communities who don't necessarily have access to the sort of like fine arts rubric of understanding a project, to connect that to their world and to sort of diversify where the project is having impact and who's getting it.
Oh, okay, thanks, my turn. I'll fill in if you want. Yeah, Zach shared with us a project, a very unique project that just, to me, it just carried so much weight and importance, because he, right after the BP explosion, he goes into the business of becoming a shrimper. And with all the earnestness of doing it as a profession, but also with a mindset of a creator. So he was looking at the structures that he set into, building relationships, putting the goals. He had some crossover in the way of like providing tours the first year, getting into the space, but he wanted to make a serious commitment in, turning a profit and as a shrimper. And it was really fascinating to me. But also using this was a kind of the idea that well, it wasn't his emphasis, but I was really struck by just the relationship, the intimacy that's being created, because he is stepping into a world that's closed off. The only people who are fishing or doing this work right now are generational, you know, 3 or 4 generations. In an industry that's viable, but still has some conflicts, and as he got into it, I could see that there's potential of this thing being a game changer. You know, the possibility of bringing in a new perspective, thinking outside the box, coming to it because of both the monetary as well as kind of for the heart of it reasons, and finding that it's a good balance. I was just really fascinated by it. And I wanted to get more information about some of the other projects he was doing, but that the details of how he did the process, his approach to it, the dynamics coming out of the relationships were just all very, very special, you know. And it was interesting because I think you were struggling with kind of where is it art and where is it work and where is it work when we come to say art. And I think, would that be true?
Somewhat, yeah.
Okay. So, all right. Stand on.
Thank you, Ben. Sure. So after I described the project, I spent a while talking about the dire circumstances of the industry as well as with farming. And then went through all the different ways that fishermen and farmers are sort of organized as primary producers and failed to kind of maintain the viability of the industry as well as resist exploitation. Compared those to like activities in arts, practice, and just and the general take home with that is that was trying to hit home the point that it's not consumption by benevolent elites that will save the way of working directly connect to the land. It's going to be how we subsidize, you know, major public pressure movements to change how we subsidize industry and regulate trade. So I think that's like, and so then say like, well, like art doesn't have it that bad, but artists are exploited, and that sucks. So I had like 2 proposals that I came to sort of like, you know, there's like solutions to shrimping. And I was like, well, how can those be solutions to art practice? And so the idea of solutions to shrimping to me is like sort of decommodifying your product. So you give it a context by marketing directly, giving you know, the sort of end user connection to labor and the inputs of that, and it's not just like shrimp. You know, it's just like it's like a whole issue and connection to landscape. And so I think the idea of like an art practice that does that, I think, could potentially reinvigorate the project of decommodifying the art object. And so if you had work that takes its value from its connection to landscape, which the landscape itself is immovable, and then that connection is only able to be evaluated by other people that share that connection. So then you end up with this way of creating value and sort of like assessing work that is landscapes and place specific. So that's like one idea. The other one is like a sort of protectionism or tariffing, which is like also a solution to shrimping, and we're, you know, sort of unfairly competing with environmental degradation and slave labor in shrimp farming. So it's like, well, here in Houston, we're also subsidizing people's art practice like outside of Houston when HA funds our institutions to show out-of-town artists. And so my slight theory is that we only, you know, we don't give them more power to individual artist grants because they do a terrible job at that. But unless you've received one, then you do. So I think, but then like but the idea is that like the money that they give to our institutions needs to go towards promoting local practitioners. I think that's actually where our cultural capital comes from, not in our institutions' ability to reflect the values of global capitalism, but to reflect our local culture. So, thank you.
Isabel, who's one of our workshop participants, and I'm Helena. And as Lauren mentioned, our 2 workshops are sort of an expanded version of something we did as one workshop in Berkeley. And for me, this work came out of, a long time interest in just sort of the stories of how artists sustain themselves. And as I was getting more into issues of art and labor and starting to read articles I wanted to share with friends, I put together this publication, Standard Deviation. So there are plenty of copies on the desk if you want to grab one on your way out. There's the first issue, which is in blue, yellow, and orange, and the second issue in green with the little red stamp. So we looked over some of the things, exercises, sort of thought experiments, tools that in a way I see like they might end up being practical tools, but maybe more importantly, they're sort of tools for starting to just break open our calcified ways of thinking about how artists relate to these issues of just some of the power structures and ideas of artists advocating for themselves in ways they might not have thought of before. And so then the bulk of the time we spent putting together this quiz. And a lot of times in my work I like to borrow a familiar format and then sort of lay it over a content or subject matter that it's not normally associated with. So just thinking about like the back of trashy magazines and the quizzes you find there, and sort of how you're supposed to be able to kind of walk through these questions and answers that lead you to a result, you know. So what if we took that and tried to deal with this gray area of artist opportunities and whether you should say yes or no to them. And I think we asked a lot of our workshop participants, to the point where maybe they felt like they should be being paid to do the work that in the workshop. So I really appreciate how far everyone stretched themselves in doing what was a lot, really, in a short amount of time. So maybe you can talk about what your experience was of that process.
Right. I thought it was like a really great process in terms of like having the audience create sort of this discussion of not just figuring out the answers, but figuring out what are the questions that are relevant to us as artists, asked, you know, people who do make decisions every day, and that it really does vary in this really weird grayscale of, should I do it, should I feel good doing it, I'm going to do it anyway, even though I feel really crappy. And I think that the idea of making this Q&A thing that's from, you know, like a 17 magazine that's relevant to teenagers, and turning that into an artist sort of question and answer thing that's relevant to an artist, but still kind of like, oh, how do we make it fun? And so it was, for us who are doing it, it was, at least for the group that I was working with, it was easy for us to kind of take it too seriously, you know, but it came to a point where it was like, wait, why are we taking it so seriously? Like, back up, how do we make it fun? How do we make it interesting and still be relevant? And so I think we did one of the questions in it, and one of the members of our group really wants to legalize, what was that, hallucinogenic mushrooms. And it was just this thing that I had to like, okay, how do I like think about this in like a setting of like the white cube of a gallery? And so, you know, like our range was like, yes, you know, we'll bring the shaman, we'll give everybody mushrooms and we'll see how it goes. So we're like, no, we're calling the cops, get out of here. You know? So, and then, you know, well, the more logical answers come in the middle area, which is the gray, which is like, is it dark gray, is it light gray? And so for us, we had to bring in that humor back, which I think helped in sort of understanding how these decision making sort of happen. I don't know, does that make sense? Great.
Yeah, so we managed to print this based on what was generated in the workshop, and there are also a bunch of these on the counter at the reception desk out there, so you can see you know, what came out of our workshop in the form of this quiz, and take it. Thanks.
Talk is called Party Out of Bounds. There's a subtitle of which was Temporary Utopia, Witchcraft, and Alternative Economies. I run a queer dance party called Chances in Chicago, which is why I'm wearing shorts today. And we fund an artist micro grant for local queer artists ranging from $250 to $1,000, among a lot of other things, but that was mostly what I was talking about. And we're kind of talking about the politics and like socioeconomics of like kind of temporary contingent spaces that are also kind of like fully kind of like operationally and financially transparent, and who also kind of like I say who as if there's more than like one that we're talking about. and that also kind of like return profit to the community with no expectation of return, and how things like sort of using cash are really good for stuff like that. Cash is like magic; it appears and then it disappears. You know, and sort of, you know, like our debates and sort of like struggles with kind of outreach, representation, kind of like reaching up for access and trying to distribute that back down while sort of like maintaining an integrity to our community, but also this conceptual idea of kind of like existing supernaturally outside the sort of like normal methods of survival. And you know, like whether that's possible as we get older and sort of bigger in scope, you know, how to kind of like preserve those qualities. We talked a lot about Virginia Woolf, and you know, as a sort of like, you know, this idea of practically understanding that you need money and means to get things done, and you should ask for those things and find out ways to secure those things, but also realizing that, you know, you are working towards something that has not been realized yet, and so you kind of have to just work to get it done. So 3 minutes, who wants to talk? I see people over here. All right. Thanks.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, it was more presentation, I think, and not entirely workshop. We didn't have projects, but I think what you brought about was bullet points of thought, and then, you know, there was times where we would talk about it, but just sort of like with starting up an organization or a project such as theirs with a very grassroots and, you know, humble beginning and idea of providing this party for the community, and then slowly as that progressed, being able to move things around and shuffle funding, so they were able to give modest amounts of money to artists, which then led to grants and projects and a memorial grant that then was given to them, and, you know, being able to work that for so many years, but then started to realize how hard, you know, how hard are you working, and if you're getting burned out, and, you know, they talked about doing a project for a major institution, and then how, you know, they were more invited to be a spectacle and less as an artist entity, and then sort of evaluating that and your own cost, and then, you know, you guys are 10 years now, I think you said, or this?
This is our 10th year.
Yeah. So yeah, then reevaluating, yeah, 10 years in, how much of that, how much of that is valued in community outreach as a dollar amount, and then how much actually bringing in as a dollar amount, and then, I guess, valuing yourself and your own time and such.
Cool. Thanks.
Robert Cruz with King Tax Staff, and we are Houston Open Studio Tours, and we gave a presentation and activity about our organization yesterday.
We spent the first half talking about Houston Open Studio Tours and its inception and the ideas of trying to bridge the gap between collectors or interested persons and artists by arranging these kind of informal studio tours where you bring people to the artist's space, and hopefully they will create a connection that will create this self-sustaining idea.
And we talked about our artist grant, which kind of came secondary from we'll talk about that. It came secondary from our studio visits, which is where we're still trying to, where we give a $1,000 artist grant to local artists of color, and how we decided to actually fund that grant, and still trying to figure out, you know, more sustainable solutions to funding that grant. And we actually had our audience turn into a funding board and fund a project that was performed for them live. They had to choose between 3 different art proposals that artist Philip Pyle did. And so the staring contest is the one that won, and finished from staring, which was really a lot of fun. Yeah, it was a little intense at times.
I think we learned some things, right?
Oh yeah.
We learned about, I think we're going to take back this idea of trying to better understand or practice, I guess is the word, the nurturing of those kinds of community relationships with artists, right? And then
even who might be partners and allies in what we're doing, like outside of just thinking of, you know, museum institutions, even like artist-run spaces and, you know, other kinds of places that might have listservs you can use or be interested in. Yeah. And we have, Rachel.
So the first part I thought was really interesting about creating self-sustaining alternative economies and the idea of resituating the idea of the collector as not someone who necessarily participates in these institutions by, you know, bankrolling them, but instead creating a community of interested people who want to support artists and want to be engaged in this artist community in a way that happens on a more community-based scale. And then I think when we actually became the funding board, a lot of the questions that came up this morning about both value and also how do we give a dollar amount to art came into play. So the discussion kind of had two parts. Which of these three proposals do we choose to fund, and then how much money do we give them? And the conversation for the first part went pretty quickly. I don't know if it was because this was the more sort of rigorous proposal with references to Marina Abramovich and had an interesting potential for people to win back money. That might have been the center. But then the more difficult part of the conversation is how much money do we give them? And so then the questions that came up is, what is our operating budget? You know, this isn't going to be an expensive program to put on because he's just sitting there staring at people. So is this funding his time? Is this funding a catalog? Is this funding work that's going to continue after this space? Is this going to fund documentation of this project? And so we came up with the amount of $1,000, which is coincidentally consistent with Wage's recommendations for what a solar project would be. And so maybe that was just fortuitous, but the kinds of conversations that we sort of had to engage in about like, what is the scale, what is the context of this money, and what does that mean? Like $1,000 for, you know, an organization that has the entire monopoly money set, is different than an organization that has just specifically raised this micro grant of $1,000 just to fund a project. So it was interesting to have these conversations in this absence of any of those constraints. All we knew was that we had to give it a number, and the conversations that kind of took place in determining what do we think about when we decide what this performance is worth, I thought was a really interesting segue to the conversations that we had today.